Dr. Ridgway earned her master and PhD degrees in sociology and social psychology from Cornell University. She taught sociology in University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and then University of Iowa, and then she went to Stanford University in 1991 and till today, still teaching in the department. From 2004 to present, Dr. Ridgway has been the Lucy Stern Professor in the Social Sciences in the Department of Sociology at Stanford University. Dr. Ridgway is particularly interested in the role of social hierarchies in everyday social relations play in the large process of stratification and inequality in a society. Much of her research focuses on the interpersonal status hierarchies, which are hierarchies of esteem and influence, and the significance of these hierarchies for inequalities based on gender, race, and social class. She is a very productive author and a scholar. She has published numerous journal articles. I counted from her resume over 90 journal articles and several books. Her recent book on this theme is this one called Framed by Gender, How Gender Inequality Persists in the Modern World. We're supposed to have this book for sale outside the door, but we are still working on it. So I don't know if we're going to have this one or not, but the bookstore has it. Dr. Ridgway is a recipient of the Cooley Mead Award for career contributions to the social psychology, the Jesse Bernard Award for contributions to gender scholarship, and elected president of the American Sociological Association between 2012 and 2013. She was also the president of Pacific Sociology Association between 1998 and 1999. I feel very lucky and thrilled to invite such an outstanding scholar and speaker as our distinguished lecture series speaker today. So let's give Dr. Ridgway a warmly welcome.
Thanks, that's a really nice introduction. Can everybody hear me all right? Is this the all loud for sound here? So what I want to do today is to talk about a kind of difficult question that I spent a lot of years thinking about, which is how does gender inequality manage to persist in an advanced industrial society like our own, like the contemporary U.S., despite all the things that work against it in the contemporary world? I mean, economic changes work against it. It's against the law, discrimination based on gender is against the law, so legal processes work against it. And also there are kind of broad institutional processes, increasing emphasis on human rights, on things like that. All that works against any kind of inequality based on gender. And then there's, of course, political processes. People who are out there organizing to change things. And women particularly, but men as well, trying to change gender inequality. All these things in the modern world work against it. So how does it kind of persist? Now, let's just dive into this, right? And this is based on, by the way, I know, unfortunately, I'll just take that. Sorry, we had it set up and then, never mind, I'll be back. Right, leaning back. Something popped up on the screen, unrelated. The little computer had other thoughts, you know, and it's mind blowing, I think. That works, right? Okay, now it's back. See, all this technology, you think that we can solve problems like that, right? This is based on this book, which you got that idea already. So here's the basic question that I was trying to pose to you when technology popped in front of us, as it often does in life. Okay, now this question that I asked, how is the gender inequality surviving right now, when all this stuff is going on that works against it, is actually a narrower version of a deeper question that has always bothered me. A question about how a system of gender hierarchy has persisted over these profound transformations in the way that gender hierarchy is rooted in the economic and social organization of society. Typically, for instance, a hierarchy between men and women and things like material resources, who has more stuff, in power, who's more powerful positions, status, who's more respected, survived the transition from an agrarian to an industrialized society. Right? In the agrarian society, gender hierarchy was based on men on land, women didn't, right? Okay, but then was shifted around and only land stopped being the main way. We had industrialization and there was control over industrialized jobs. So you'd think that would, not apart the way gender inequality was structured, right? But it didn't. You think it knocked the colors out from under it, but it didn't, right? Somehow or another, something happened. And then in the new industrial, there was like a quick moment, and then in the new industrialized economy, it was recreated in a new form, right? In a new form, and the industrial form. And then more recently, as women have flooded into the paid labor force, an underlying system of gender inequality has managed to refashion itself and persist in a modified form. How does this happen? And while we had major changes, for instance, reductions in gender inequality from 1970 with all those women flooding into the labor force, but the improvements, the sort of reductions, the improvements in gender inequality kind of stalled in about 1990. And we've been floating around at about the same level without going much further, and many further since about 1990. So we have this rapid change of improving and reducing gender inequality, and then stalled. What's going on? All right, what's going on? And the question that I really want to ask is how? That is, through what processes can this happen? How does it happen? How can society utterly reorganize itself and take something like gender inequality and preserve it over the utter reorganization and recreate it again in a new world, utterly new world? So how can it happen, right? And I specifically, because there's two ways you could answer that. One would be a historical way. You could say, okay, well, let's look at the moments of transition. And there's some great historical studies like that, switch to the industrialized society from agrarian society and all that, about what happened and specific things that happened. But I want to ask a more general question. Are there any can we locate any general social processes through which gender, as a principle of social difference and social inequality, manages to rewrite itself into new forms of social and economic organization as those new forms, like say the industrialized economy, emerge in society. Right? Society is changing and new forms are emerging. Is there some way that gender inequality and that idea that is written into that new process? So even when the old things go away, it's reinvented for a new era. Well, obviously, I'm asking that question because I think we can find some general processes. And I want to tell you about some that I'm saying. I want to propose some, at least one general force for persistence. Now, this force for persistence that I'm talking about acts in the face of the level of the thing, right? So it's working to recreate it, other things are working to undermine it. So what we actually see is a kind of tension point that's going on. It's not persistence is not the only thing going on. Leveling things are also going on. But I'm going to tell you about the persistence. Okay. So let's be arguing. So I locate a powerful dynamic of contemporary persistence in people's everyday use of gender as a primary cultural tool for organizing their relationships with other people. a way of figuring out who people are in order to relate to them in organized social relations. An innocent sounding thing, right? But I'm going to argue that widely shared cultural beliefs about gender, about who we think men and women are, act as what I call common knowledge. I'll explain what that means later. A common knowledge frame that people use to jumpstart the process of making sense of one another. I meet you, who are you? Right? And I use gender as a start point. When you're a man, you're a woman, okay, it starts me, right? It jumpstarts the process, right? Make sense of one another in order to coordinate my actions with you, right? And have a social relationship with you. But the thing is, the use of gender as an initial framing device for making sense of people, I argue, spreads gendered meanings, including assumptions of inequality that have historically been embedded in our understandings of who men and women are, right? It spreads those gendered meanings beyond contexts associated with sex and reproduction to all spheres of social life that we carry out through social relationships. And of course, that's practically everything. Through gender's role in organizing social relations, then, I'm arguing that gender inequality gets rewritten into new economic and social arrangements as people create those, right, as they emerge. Preserving that inequality, create them through social relationships, and that preserves that inequality in modified form over these socioeconomic transformations. Okay, now this persistence process turns on the fact that common knowledge, cultural beliefs about gender change more slowly than do the material arrangements between men and women. Through material arrangements, what we're actually doing with our lives change, right? But our cultural beliefs about who men and women are, these common knowledge cultural beliefs, change more slowly, right, than the material arrangements, even though those beliefs do eventually respond to material changes. But as a result of this cultural lag, the fact that these cultural assumptions are lagging behind material change, at the edge of social change, people confront their new, uncertain circumstances with gender beliefs that are more traditional than the circumstances they're facing. And also sites of innovation where people develop new forms of economic activity. Think about the famous garages where new types of IT things were developed, right? Sites of innovation where people develop new types of social organization tend to be small interpersonal settings that are often outside of established organizations. Both the uncertainty, what are we doing here? We're trying to do something new and different. There's a lot of uncertainty about that. And the interpersonal, it's us, it's just us. In that situation, increase the likelihood that the people who are there will implicitly draw, without unconsciously draw, on the too convenient cultural frame of gender to help organize their new ways of doing things. And as they do that, though, they inadvertently rewrite trailing cultural assumptions about gender difference and gender inequality into the new activities, the new procedures, the new forms of organization that they create, in effect reinventing gender inequality for a new era. Okay, now that's in a nutshell the argument I'm going to make. Now obviously that's kind of a big abstract argument. I need to look at it hard and also give you some more evidence. Why should you believe it? I don't explain it more, but suggest some little more evidence about it. Well, as you can see, this argument that I put forward has kind of two parts. One part focuses on the interpersonal level, people coordinating their behavior and making sense of things. Another part focuses up on the big level of this common knowledge cultural beliefs about society that supposedly lag behind changes, right? And that also those beliefs, in fact, got rewritten into new into sites of innovation. Well, in this talk, I'm going to try to talk about talk as briefly as I can about the interpersonal part, and then focus on the cultural and organizational parts that are central to my claims about this being part of the persistence process, this being part of the process that causes gender inequality to persist in the modern world. And so, in particular, what I'm going to look at here is evidence for cultural lag in widely shared gender beliefs, and evidence that these lagging beliefs become inscribed in new forms of work as they develop. And there I'm going to look at some evidence from the high-tech evidence. Right. Okay, now let's start, so a little bit about that interpersonal thing. So what do I mean by saying gender is a primary cultural frame for organizing social relations? Very abstract. Well, I don't need to tell you that all of us depend for our very survival on social relations with others. To get the stuff we want in these lives, we need to be able to relate to other people, right? But social relations pose a well-known problem. To relate to another in order to accomplish some kind of valued goal, we have to find some way to coordinate our behavior. If you and I want to do something together, we have to find some way to coordinate our behavior. Now, classic sociologists like Irving Goffman, if you ever come across him, but also contemporary economic game theorists, right, have both arrived at the same conclusion about what it takes to solve coordination problems. For you and me to coordinate our behavior. For you and me to coordinate effectively, we need some shared common number. We need to be drawing in the same script. Now you might say, I can coordinate my behavior with you by just talking to you. But actually that doesn't totally solve it, as you've often found. When you tell a friend, I'm going to meet you, and they say, okay, I'll meet you. But you still don't know, did they get your message? Did they find out? And you can still miss that. It doesn't solve it. What solves it is we both have a shared plan. Whenever we're in trouble, if there's ever an emergency, we're all going to call X. Right? That works perfectly, coordinates our behavior. So you need this kind of shared script, right? And that's that common knowledge. And this common knowledge, of course, is cultural knowledge, right? We need to use as a basis of our joint action. Now, I'm going to, in particular, I'm going to argue that we need a shared way of categorizing and defining who I am and you are, self and other are in this situation, so I can say, you're this person and I'm this, and we're in this situation, and you're going to do this, so therefore I'm going to do that, right? So we can anticipate how each of us is likely to act and then coordinate our behavior. Right, so I need to have some way of figuring out who you are, so we need to figure, and therefore who I am, so we can anticipate each other's behavior, and then we do the dance. Right? We say, fine, do the dance. Right? Well, systems for categorizing and defining things are based on contrast. You can only say something is this in comparison to something that you say it is not, right? So that means that defining self and other in order to relate focuses us on finding shared principles of social difference that we can use to categorize and make sense of them. I'm arguing then that this coordination problem that's inherent to organizing social relations with other people drives populations of people who routinely interact with one another, our society, right, to develop shared social category systems based on culturally defined standards of difference, like gender, but also race and language, right? Okay, now, to manage social relations in real time, some of these cultural systems have to be super simple, something that you can apply to anybody at any time and split that, right? Super simple. Oversimple, so that they can be quickly applied as framing devices to anyone in order to start the process of defining self and other in a situation. Right? You can get more complicated and fancy afterwards, but you have to start somewhere. Right? You need something real fast to jumpstart the process of making sense of it. And in fact, psychology studies of how people make sense of others suggests that a very small number of these kind of cultural difference systems, about three, serve as the primary categories of person perception in a society. These primary categories define the things that a person in that society has to know about somebody to render that person sufficiently meaningful to relate to them. Who are you? Right? Well, I can locate you in these three ways according to our social cultural beliefs. Okay, all right, I can start figuring out. I can ask you a question and have some idea what you're saying back to me. Right? In the U.S., the evidence is sex, race, and age are primary categories. Other societies, sex and age, for obvious reasons, are typically primary categories in a society. Race is an American thing. We understand it in a way that really no other culture does. We have our own thing about that. In another society, it might be religion or a region where you're born or caste or something else might be a primary category. Right? But in our society, it's sex, race, and age. In fact, it's very clear that gender is a primary frame in the U.S. right now. Psychology studies show that we, in fact, automatically and nearly instantly sex categorize any specific person. When I say automatically, I mean do it without thinking about it, and we can't stop ourselves from doing it. That's what I mean. Sex categorize any specific person we intend to relate to. In other words, you can't look at a person without going male, female. Now you can, by the way, look at them and change your mind, right? You can look at them and they go, male, and then you get a closer look and they're like, oh, female, right? That's not the problem. It's not that you can't change. It's that you can't not to have a thought about whether they're male or female, right? No matter how far away or distant they are, whatever, you do this. You can't see a face on a screen without doing this study showing, right? It's scary how we do that, right? So once you've done that, just male, female them, right? Our subsequent categorizations, that can of course go a lot further, you don't stop there, but your subsequent categorizations of them, say your boss or your coworker, right? The thing is, your understanding of that boss or your coworker or the judge or the cop that pulled you over is nested within your prior understanding of that person as male or female and the way that culture understands it. So it becomes the female cop that pulls you over. Right? The male coworker that you're talking to. And the meaning is slightly different. The female cop, the vibe of that is slightly different, right, than the male cop. Right? Okay, now that happens. This instant sex categorization, not just in person when you're actually dealing with a person, but also over the internet. When you're sort of dealing with a line of sight, people make an assumption about the sex category of the person they're dealing with. They could make a mistake, right? Someone could find out that the 13-year-old girl they thought they were exchanging notes with is a 57-year-old FBI man, right? But, it could be wrong. But people make an assumption. They don't think that they have an ungendered person. That somehow there's an assumption, right? There's an implicit assumption, even though you might be wrong. So we do it, right? The same thing happens, right? When we examine a person's resume, right? Or we think about the kind of person we want to hire. Who would be a good ideal worker be? You can't kind of try to think of a worker without implicitly sex categorizing, which you could see the effects that have. So this initial framing by sex never quite disappears from our understanding of any person that we deal with or ourselves in relation to them. And that way then, I say we frame our framing by gender literally before we know. Okay, now primary categories of person perception, including sex category. And sex category is the phrase I'm using to refer to the idea of labeling someone male or female, right? Which is a social process. Labeling so I'm not now talking about what the actual physical sex is or whatever. I'm talking about how you classify male or female. So these primary categories of person perception, like sex categories, work as cultural frames for coordinating behavior by associating you being categorized as male or female with these widely shared cultural beliefs about how males and females are expected to behave in our society, how males are supposed to be compared to females are supposed to be. In other words, we also stereotypes. Right? These are stereotypes, right? Now, we all know common gender stereotypes. As cultural knowledge, you are not culturally confident, you know these gender stereotypes. But I doubt that very many people in this room at all endorse these stereotypes. What I mean is endorse them and think, yes, that's true, that's what men and women really are, that's it, that's the truth. You don't think that. You just think, but what you do think is that most people hold these stereotypes. Most people think men are this way. Most people think women are that way. And because you think most people hold these beliefs, you expect others to judge you according to the stereotypes. You walk into the room in a public setting, and you think the eyes that are looking at you are judging you according to that frame. Right? Are judging you according to that frame. And as a result, when you figure out how do I want to behave, how do I want to present myself, what clothes do I want to put on myself, right? You have to take those cultural beliefs into account in your own behavior, even if you do not endorse it, because you're going to be judged by it. Now, you may decide to resist those beliefs. You may say, they're going to think this of me. Well, I don't care, I'm going to challenge them and do that. You may do that, but that's a particular maneuver you make in relation to those beliefs, right? So in that way, then, these shared cultural beliefs act as the rules, the social rules for coordinating public behavior on the basis of gender. And this idea that men are supposed to act this way, women are supposed to act that way, and therefore, right? Those are the rules for coordinating behavior on the basis of gender. And as we would expect from the social rules for gender, widely shared gender stereotypes have been shown to have a prescriptive, what you should and will be criticized if you don't do, as well as a descriptive, what everybody just expects, right? Right, gender stereotypes have both descriptive and prescriptive parts to them. Now the content, you might say, well, this is about difference. Men are supposed to be that way, and women are supposed to be that. Where's the inequality in that, right? It's difference, but is it inequality? Well, here's the rub, right? The content of our gender stereotypes shows the character, what's in the picture, right? When you look at the picture, what do you see? Is perceived as being more proactive and agentically competent from Mars, right? And the lower status group is seen as more reactive and emotionally expressive from Venus, right? In that way, then, the way we understand difference in gender implies inequality, right? And that means that when you coordinate behavior on the basis of cultural assumptions about gender, written into these gender stereotypes, the coordination produces social relations of inequality as well as difference, right? Okay. Now, exactly how, right now I've talked very generally about how these stereotypes affect things. Exactly how does the gender frame shape behavior and judgments? Well, research shows that when you sex categorize another person, that unconsciously primes gender stereotypes in your mind. Now, priming means it pops up on the background screen. It's a little bit like pressing your DVR and having it come on, right? Now that doesn't play the whole thing. It just gets it. It's just ready, right? It's ready to be played, right? So it primes gender stereotypes and it makes them cognitively available to shape your behavior and judgments. Importantly, the extent to which these stereotypes actually do shape your behavior can vary from negligible, nobody could find it, measure it, to substantial, depending on the nature of the particular situation you're in, and also your own motives and interests in it. To what extent are you interested in playing the gender game in this situation? Also has an impact.
What matters is the extent to which information and gender beliefs helps you figure out how to act in the situation. And in some situations, highly gendered, culturally gendered situations, those gender beliefs give you all kinds of clues on how to behave. They're really important. Other situations, they're in the way back. You're focusing on other things, right? And that can affect what's going on. So as part of the primary person frame, cultural frame, the instructions for behavior that are encoded in gender stereotypes are exceedingly abstract and diffuse. Be strong and assertive. Be warm and nurturing. Okay, right? Very abstract, very diffuse. It's because they're so abstract and diffuse that you can apply them to virtually any situation and any person. But the flip side of it, that's part of them being super simplified, right? But the flip side of it is that they don't take you very far in figuring out exactly what to do in this situation. How should I behave here, right? It gives you a little initial frame, but it does not tell you where to go from there. In contrast, the institutional context in which you're actually behaving, you're in the shopping mall, you're in the university, right? You're in the workplace, right? These institutional contexts that govern most everyday social relationships, right, they contain very defined, they're much more specific in terms of the instructions they give you in terms of how to behave. They contain these defined roles and these expected relations. A boss-employee, okay, you know what that says about behavior. Clerk, customer, okay, I know that. That's a routine I know. For individuals then, as you're going about your daily relations, doing stuff, you're here, you're there, right? It's these institutional identities and rules that are in the foreground of your sense of who you are and how you should behave and what you're doing here. Gender, in contrast, is almost always a background identity. Not in the foreground of what you're doing. It's a background identity. This, in fact, is really important. It's a secret to how gender works. Situations are rarely just about gender. Gender is a framing background, a coloring, a flavoring to what you're doing because it's in the background, right? As a background identity, gender typically acts to bias in gender directions the performance of behaviors that you undertake in the name of a more foregrounded organizational role or identity. So gender becomes a way of acting like a doctor. It becomes a way of being a student. It becomes a way of managing a project. It becomes a way of doing something else, right? But it's a flavoring, a bias, a style you add to what you're doing. Okay, now a wide variety of research shows that the extent and direction of the biases that the background gender frame introduces into our expectations for ourselves and for other people, right, fall into a distinctive pattern, a very distinctive pattern. There's a lot of evidence on this. This summarizes, there's a lot of things there. Look it up. Anyway, but here's kind of what that pattern is. In mixed-sex settings, that is where both men and women are present, in which the context or whatever the task or goal that anybody's focused on is relatively gender neutral, not something the culture links with men and women. It's not a guy thing, it's not a women thing, it's just stuff, right? It's relatively gender neutral, but it is a mixed-sex setting. In that situation, cultural beliefs that men are more agentically competent, and those status beliefs, right? Cultural beliefs that men are more agentically competent and more worthy of status advantage them over otherwise similar women, but only in the modern world modestly so. It gives men a modest advantage in the modern world, not a big advantage over women. In settings, however, that are culturally typed as masculine, okay, now we're not just in some kind of general neutral thing, we're in something that's strongly associated. This is, like in medicine, this is neuroscience or something strongly associated with men. Right? More culturally typed as masculine. Gender beliefs there are not as far in the background. They move a little more forward, and they bias judgments and behaviors more strongly in favor of men. So men get a modest advantage in terms of presumptions about how competent and worthy of authority they are in gender-neutral settings, and a slightly larger advantage over similar women in a masculine type setting. And what about context culturally linked with women, though? Context culturally linked with women, like say nursing or something of that sort, biases weakly favor women over men, right? Biasly weakly favor women over men. They're seen as more competent, except for positions of authority. Men are advantaged for authority, the evidence shows, in our society in all settings. Okay, now if you think about that pattern, I'm going to come back to that pattern. I'm going to make use of that pattern in a couple of minutes in the talk. But if you look at that pattern and you use your imagination, I think you can see how that pattern of implicit biases, these are things people are not conscious of. This is not prejudice. This is implicit bias, taken for granted assumptions that are leading to biased judgments, right? This implicit biases acting through everyday social relations. People are job interviews, doing everyday social relations, right? The social relations that make up the worlds of work and home, household. It helps reinforce, these biases help reinforce and reproduce the structures of inequality in the modern society that we're already familiar with. For instance, the gender gap in wages. You could see how this might lead to a gender gap in wages. The glass ceiling for women's and women's leadership. You can see that men being advantaged for authority would help enact, right, the glass ceiling. Also, if there's by more complicated reasoning, we can show how this would help contribute to the sex-segregated job structure. That is the idea that most jobs are jobs that are done primarily by either men or women rather than being fully mixed, right? And in particular with sex-segregated job structure, the fact that there's both what sociologists call vertical segregation, meaning men are more likely to be in high authority and women in lower authority jobs, and horizontal, the difference dimension, men are more likely to be in muscle jobs and women are more likely to be in service jobs, right? You can see the stereotypes operating, right, and reproducing that. And then also the last kind of thing in the everyday patterns of inequality is the household division of labor, right? Who does more of the child care, who does more of the housework, and so on. You can see all this contributing to that, right? Well, of course, this everyday reproduction of the structures of inequality for which we're familiar, the ones that exist within established institutional structures, our contemporary labor force, our contemporary family, the everyday reproduction of inequality is, of course, an important part of the persistence process. But the world of work, the world is constantly changing, New jobs are created, other stuff, people develop new ways of doing things. So the future of gender as a principle of inequality doesn't lie with just reproduction of established structures, right? It lies with sites at the edge of social and technological change, where the new stuff that will become the economy of the future, become the social family of the future, the new stuff is being developed, right? That's where the future of whether or not gender equality persists is whether or not it makes the leap into the new things, rather than just is reenacted in the old stuff, right? These sites, what I'm calling sites of innovation, are sites where substantially new forms of work and new forms of social life are created. Some of these innovations then become the blueprints for new industries and new ways. Most of them disappear, right? But some of them become the blueprints for new industries and ways of life. So the critical question is whether or not the gender frame that acts through these everyday social relations infuses assumptions about gender inequality even into these innovative contexts where people are explicitly devoted to doing things differently. People don't set out to create a new industry by saying, I'm going to recreate my father's Oldsmobile, right? That's not what they're trying to do. They say, forget Dad's Oldsmobile. I want a whole new car. I want to create a Tesla, right? I want a whole new thing, right? I want a whole new thing. Can it do that, right? Because if it did, if the way this gender frame infuses gendered meanings into things that people do interpersonally, if it can infuse that even into the interpersonal relations by which they develop the Tesla, then it can transform the organizational procedures of Tesla, right, and create the, inequality, and I'm not blaming Tesla now, I just grabbed it as an example. Dive into it. It would reinvent gender inequality for a new era. So what about that? What here? Did I jump ahead? No, I think I fell behind. Sorry about that. So obviously, I'm going to argue the gender frame can and does do this for the reasons that I mentioned at the outset. First, sites of innovation are typically small and interpersonally oriented settings. Secondly, so if there's something is affecting interpersonal behavior, it's interpersonal behavior through which people invent things, right? So it's going to be there, right? Second, these sites of innovation are settings in which the participants' determination to do things differently weakens the normally powerful impact of existing institutional procedures as guides to behavior. People are specifically trying not to just use something that they learned at their last job. But they have to do something. They have to organize themselves somehow. Both these factors increase the likelihood that participants will unconsciously fall back on familiar person-based schemas like gender, also race and age, to help organize their inherently uncertain task. And then, of course, when they do that, I also argue that the shared gender stereotypes that people have to fall back on trail behind the changes in material circumstances that they find themselves in. So they have kind of more retro gender beliefs than these nouveau conditions that they're facing. So fine, that's a nice argument, but what's the evidence behind it? Well, let's first look at some evidence that cultural beliefs about gender do lag behind changes in women's material status in society. And then let's turn to evidence that lagging beliefs infect sites of innovation. When changing circumstances, such as changing social circumstances, such as women's growing commitment to the labor force, cause people to have more and more gender non-stereotypic experiences. In other words, you keep meeting more and more women who don't look like the stereotype, right? Why wouldn't that just change our stereotypes, right? Why won't stereotypes just change? If we have cultural beliefs about what men and women are like, if increasingly men and women that we meet aren't like it, then why don't our cultural beliefs just change, right? Just change. Well, the answer is that changing experiences do change our stereotypes. They will eventually change our stereotypes, but the impact of atypical experiences on our stereotypes is blunted by two processes that slow the change of stereotypes. At the individual level, gender stereotypes are subject to powerful biases because we believe them, they're so taken granted, so part of our life, what psychologists call confirmation biases, which is just basically the tendency to see what you expect to see. So if you're kind of assuming men and women are this way, then you kind of see it. And then little things that don't fit, you sort of don't notice. And you tend to read into it, things that may not have been there, but that would have been there if everything had been more traditional. So those are confirmations. So those things keep people from noticing gender inconsistent information or to reinterpret it as consistent. So partly people just resist seeing their experiences as disconfirming until the disconfirmation gets more extreme, right? So that's a slowing process. Even more important, however, is a more social process that derives from the use of gender as a frame for coordinating behavior. People's assumption that gender stereotypes are widely shared, common knowledge, right, that they're the rules for gender behavior, inhibits the public expression of explicitly disconfirming behavior information. That is, have you ever had the experience where, say, a service person that you don't know comes to the door to fix something in your house, and the person makes they're trying to make conversation. They make a polite, friendly, but perhaps very stereotypically gendered, well, how's the lady of the house today, kind of comment. And you could say, I don't think of myself as but that just seems heavy-handed. We don't need that, right? So you probably sort of play along. I mean, you also just want to get the plumbing fixed, right? You're not need a big conversation about life. So you say, oh, fine, how are you? Gee, like that. And what both of you have done is act in this totally gender stereotypic. You say that person, gee, this guy must really believe gender stereotypes because he treated me that way. But maybe he thinks, oh, well, look at that middle-aged lady. She obviously believes that I better treat her according to it, right? And then I react that way, right? So we both display to each other believing in the stereotypes, even though maybe neither of us does. I don't tell him and he doesn't tell me that that's not how we think about men and women. We just play the dance. We both know it, it's simple, and the toilet gets fixed, right? So we do that and that's the end of it. But it reinforces my sense and his sense that most people believe gender stereotypes and those are the rules. Those are the rules, right? Okay, so that slows it down. And there's research to confirm this process. Speaking of slowing us down, I won't go through it all right now, but studies have been done that show how people grab hold of gender-consistent information as a way of dealing with people they don't know in order to make things smooth, to smooth their social relationship. So the result of that, though, is to suppress people. It's not only that people resist understanding their experiences inconsistent, but also once they do understand their experiences as inconsistent, they resist broadcasting their gender nonconformity to others. So we don't, except for trusted others that they know well, but publicly, right? They resist it. And so that keeps preserving these beliefs over a long time. Okay, we can see then why cultural beliefs about gender should lag behind the changing circumstances and actual behavior. Do they? What's the evidence? Well, measures of descriptive gender stereotypes ask people to rate how the typical man or woman is seen in the U.S., right, on a series of traits like independent, forceful, or nurturing. In studies done in the 1970s, the typical man is seen as substantially higher than the typical woman on a long list of agentic instrumental traits, right? These are the traits that our culture associates more generally with high status and effective competence: independent, forceful, competitive, so on. Women are rated intelligent, assertive, analytic, all that. Women are rated, in contrast to men, much higher on communal traits like warm, kind, generous, nurturing. Okay, that's the 70s. Studies done since the late 1990s up to the present, right, show no change at all in the gender gap and commonality. People have the same views that women are a lot nicer, or a lot more communal than men. But a slight, nicer isn't really the same word, right? But there's a slight narrowing in the gender gap in agentic traits. There has been some change, in other words. What this narrowing is it shows that ratings of men have not changed. They're still seen as forceful, competitive, all that stuff as they were in the 70s. What has changed is women, right? Women are now seen as almost the same as men on the softer aspects of agency, like, for instance, analytic, reasoning. Women are not now widely seen as less intelligent than men. They used to be, but they're not now. So these softer aspects of agency, like intelligent, analytic, reasoning, things have changed, and women are seen more similar to men. Women, however, are still rated much lower than men in the stronger aspects of agency, like aggressive, forceful, leader-like, right? The stronger, more executive, get-it-done aspects of agency, women are still seen as considerably less than men. Now, the direction of change that's evident in these studies is just what you would expect, given that men, right, the beliefs about men haven't changed much, but it's not men's social roles that have changed. It's women's social roles that have changed by getting more and more involved in the workforce. And that, of course, makes them look more agentic, right? So the changes we get make a lot of sense. But what's really striking about this evidence is how much remains unchanged in gender stereotypes, given the massive changes in women's behavior. Right now, women are in the labor force almost in the same proportions as men, right? And that, as opposed to in the 1970s when they were only about half as likely to be in the paid labor force as men. So massive changes, little squeaky changes, right, in the stereotypes. So what we basically see in these stereotypes, men are still from Mars, and women are still mostly from Venus, but Venus has got an edge she didn't used to have, right? But she's still Venus. So descriptive stereotypes, while generally following changes in women's roles, do seem to lag well behind those role changes. Now, prescriptive stereotypes, which is what men and women should and should not be, not just what they're thought to be on average, but what they should be, what is desirable for them to be, those haven't changed at all, right? Those are just the same as they were in the 70s. Right? Contemporary research that shows that both the hierarchical aspect of stereotypes, women should be dominant, Freudian slip there. Men should be dominant, women should not, right? And the difference dimension, women should be communal and men should be independent and competitive, right? Those dimensions of gender stereotypes still carry a should-be prescriptive edge in contemporary U.S. So they not only remain strong, but they're just unchanged from the past. So what we end up seeing is that widely shared stereotypes, despite a lot of change in our daily behavior, our widely shared stereotypes are still surprisingly retro. So you say, okay, cool, our stereotypes are retro. Who cares? Do they affect anything? Do they have an impact on emergent forms of gender relations at sites of innovation? In new places, are they having an impact? Well, to support my argument about how the gender frame reestablishes gender inequality at sites of innovation, we need evidence that not merely shows that there's inequality in new businesses, but because that inequality could be produced by any old thing having nothing to do with my argument, right? We need evidence that the inequality we see looks the way we would expect it to be if it were a result of this gender frame I'm talking about acting through social relations. Well, remember that distinctive pattern of biases that I told you about? That tells you that there should be greater inequality in some situations, these masculine type settings, than in, say, just settings that are just gender neutral but mixed sex, right? So that predicts a different pattern of inequality. So if changes that are happening through social relations ought to show those differences. So if we see patterns that match that in these sites of innovation, I'm going to look at high-tech startups, then that would be some evidence, right, that the gender frame is actually producing the type of inequality that we're seeing there, and that would actually support it. Well, here's an example of that kind of evidence, right, from the world of work. Right? This is all mostly based on some research done by two different sociologists, Whittington and Smith-Duer, and they did a set of studies examining how women scientists fared in startup companies compared to more traditional established research firms. Now, some of the innovative startups that they jointly looked at were biotech firms that are based in the life sciences, biology and the life sciences. Others were information technology firms that were based in engineering and the physical sciences. But the firms that they studied, they were particularly interested in firms that had adopted a new groovy kind of organizational logic called the network form, right? The network form. Work in these firms is organized, and these are the firms, you know, you see on TV with the dog and everything. These are firms where work is organized in project teams. In other words, rather than individuals, people form teams and they work on projects. And the teams are often constructed with some scientists from 2 or 3 different startup companies. And so you basically, a company has a network of partners and they say, I'll give 2 people the project and this other company 2 people, and they get these teams. And that's how they do their work. It's a whole different way of organizing a company, right? And scientists, so they were, and here they looked at biotech companies and information technology companies, IT companies, that use this network form. And scientists in these, who work for these firms move flexibly amongst these project teams. They basically kind of join, like, hey, that sounds like a cool project. Can I be part of it and work on it? Or no, I'm going to go over there and work on this other team, right? And the hierarchies of control over their behavior are relatively flat. So the question is this informal, flexible, less hierarchical, team-based structure advantageous or disadvantageous for the women scientists who work in these high-tech firms? Well, the gender frame argument predicts that the answer will be different for biotech firms than for IT firms, despite the fact that these firms share the same organizational structure, right? So if we have the organizational structure holding constant, then if you get different inequality regimes, that's reasonably good evidence that it's being caused by these interpersonal gender relations, not the organization one. Okay. So these different predictions help us examine not only whether gender inequality persists in these startups, but whether it looks like it would if it was created by the background effects of the gender frame on workplace relations. So let's look at the biotech, right? Applying that distinctive pattern of biases created by the gender frame to biotech startups, here's what we would expect. The life sciences are not now strongly sex-typed in our contemporary culture. Women now constitute half the PhDs in the life sciences. This is biology and so on. Women have kind of quietly taken over biology, and they're now at least 50% of the PhDs in it. Therefore, this is now one of those mixed-sex, gender-neutral work contexts, right? Because there are half of them. That means about half the workers are going to be men, half the workers are women, mixed sex. And it's not something that the culture thinks is particularly a girl thing or a guy thing. It's more gender-neutral. So what does the background gender frame argument say that should be? Well, it says that cultural beliefs about gender should be salient in the background in biotech firms, but only diffusely so. And so we would expect these beliefs to create only modest advantages for men in expected competence. Facing only modest biases, women scientists in biotech should have the basic credibility as scientists with their coworkers that they need to take effective advantage of the opportunities that are offered by the flexible structure of these team-based projects in innovative firms. Because the thing is, to join a team, people have to think, wow, you have something to offer to them. You've got to say, hey, I'm a talented scientist. It's like joining the baseball team, right? Do they want you on the team, right? So you got to have credibility as a scientist. So people say, yeah, join our team, right? Well, I'm basically saying that in this situation, women face modest biases, but they have basic credibility as scientists. So they can join the team. And they should be able to press forward with their interests. I like this, I'm good at that. I'll go to that team. Find projects that match their skills and excel, right? As a result, in the biotech context, the informal, flexible organization form could be more advantageous for women than would be a traditional hierarchical structure like they might find, say, in a pharmaceutical, a large pharmaceutical firm, right? And in fact, Whittington and Smith-Dorr find that women life scientists do better in these innovative biotech firms than they do in more traditionally hierarchical pharmaceutical firms. In comparison to these more traditional hierarchical firms, women in these flexible firms achieve more supervisory positions, and they are equal to men in the likelihood of having at least one patent to their name. And of course, in these startups, patents are the coin of the realm. Right? So even in these innovative firms, the total number of patents that women acquire is less than that of similar men, right? So they are just as likely to have at least one patent, but they still don't have quite as many patents as similar men. Now, that remaining disadvantage is not surprising if we remember that the background gender biases still modestly favor men, even in this innovative biotech context. Right? So what we see is this pattern of modest disadvantage, which is what we were predicting. There is inequality, it does persist there, but it's a modest level, as we were predicting. What about IT? In contrast, the life sciences, of course, engineering, the physical sciences are still strongly sex-typed in favor of men in our society. That means that the background gender frame in the IT context is more powerfully relevant, right, and creates stronger implicit biases against women's competence than in the biotech settings. And in that setting, we would expect the informality and the flexibility of the innovative firm to be, if anything, a disadvantage for women scientists. Facing strong challenges, their credibility, right, it's harder for the women to take it. There is no job structure that says that this project team has to take them on. And the team looks at them and says, what do you have to offer? Right? And it's harder than if there was a thing, well, no, that's the number 3 person in that, so that person's now a member of your team, sorry, right? That's not how it works, right? So it's in fact a disadvantage in that situation. So it's harder for women to take advantage of the flexible structure. And also in the context of a masculine type gender frame, the informal work structure can lead to a boys' club atmosphere in these innovative IT forms, something that there have been movies about and things of that sort. As we might expect then, in her study of patenting, Whittington found that women physical scientists and engineers were no better off in these small, flexible startups than they were in traditional research and development firms like, for instance, aerospace companies. In both contexts, they have significant disadvantages compared to men. They're less likely to patent at all, and they have fewer patents overall than comparable men. In another well-known study, the researchers found that women engineers actually did better in a traditional rules-structured aerospace company than an informal IT startup, because in the context of a disadvantaging background gender frame, formal rules leveled the playing field a little bit. These studies show not only that gender inequality is reinscribed at these sites of innovation in the work world, but that it takes the form predicted by the effects of the background gender frame. And also the fact that the organizational form of the firms is held constant in these studies increases our confidence that the effects of the gender frame are behind the differing patterns of inequality we see. So this is pretty good evidence, right, that the gender frame is a force for persistence at innovative work sites. Now, one might nevertheless ask whether these local effects in startups mean much, right? Will they persist past the initial stages of a startup as the new firm grows, right? And will they affect other firms in their field? It's plausible to expect that they will, based on other research. Gender effects operating in the background of workplace relations in these startups work together with the organizational logic of the firms to shape how people come to think about working, right? What is the way you do work at Facebook? What is the way you do work at Google? How do you do things, right? What are the routine practices and procedures? These workplace practices and routines then carry the implicit stamp of those founding gender effects. As these practices and routines become institutionalized, they themselves become the agent by which the gender regime is reproduced in the firm. The sociologist James Barron and his colleagues in a large study of high-tech startups have shown that these initial organizational blueprints, when a firm is first founded, can have lasting implications for how men and women fare in the firm, long after the initial founders leave the firm and so on. And research shows that these effects can spread to other firms too. In his study of organizational genealogies of Silicon Valley law firms, Phillips shows that when people leave first firms to found a similar type of firm, they transfer the practices and routines. And the practices have embedded in them gendered logics. And guess what? They recreate in the new situation comparable gender forms of gender inequality. That means that the way the background gender frame infuses gender inequality into the organizational routines of small pioneering firms potentially has long-range consequences for the future. I am, by the way, about to end, so you'll be glad to know that. Long-range consequences for the future of gender inequality in the workplace. So I have taken you on kind of a wild ride here of stereotypes, social relations, and startups, right? But, so there's Mr. Toad's wild ride here, but I hope in the process of doing this that I've convinced you that our everyday use of gender as a basic framing device for social relations acts as a powerful, if implicit, process by which gender as a principle of social difference and inequality is rewritten into new forms of social and economic organization as those forms emerge in society. Now, this persistent dynamic does not mean that gender inequality can never be overcome. Yes, it's a little out of awareness. Yes, it's happening without us quite intending it. But that doesn't mean that we can't stop it. There are well-known ways to try to suppress these effects, to change, to make ourselves aware of them and suppress them. So these processes can be fought. But the fact that this persistence dynamic is happening means that it won't be overcome by itself. Gender inequality won't wither away, right? It won't wither away. You need to keep working at it. There are, in fact, powerful economic, legal, and institutional forces that work against gender inequality. So there's reason to think, reason to be hopeful, reason to think that a lot of things are going to push back against this, right? And of course, included in this is women's own self-interest, which also lead them to vote with their feet frequently to push against gender inequality in the modern world. But this persistence dynamic does mean that the forces for change are not unopposed. There's an undertow, right, that needs to be fought. And as a result, progress towards inequality in the future is likely to be both uneven and require constant. In other words, you're going to go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and that's going to keep happening. And don't give up, because that takes that form. And it also means you got to keep at it, right? To keep at it, and that's the way that change will come. Okay, so thanks for putting up with all that for a long time and the whole evening. But anyway, so I thank you for your attention.
Yeah, we have the book now outside of the door. If you want to buy the book, you can buy it. But if you have some questions, we can take a few questions here.
Yeah, how about just some questions?
Right.
Yeah. Worry about the book. I know I've been talking at you. Got one back. Is that a question back there or a phone? Yeah, that's a phone. I know I've been talking at you, which makes it hard to shift frame and start asking questions. But but I'm curious. I mean, what you find, you know, how you react. Either things that you're curious about, what happens next. Yeah.
Do you have a stereotype that you feel like is most harmful?
You mean a gender or an aspect of the gender stereotypes that's most harmful? That's tricky. I would say that right now, the association of authority with men is a huge problem. You know, undermining that so it becomes more equal, it's more gender neutral, so authority is more about things other than gender, right? Things maybe you know more or whatever, you know, as opposed to gender. I think that aspect, I personally would pick that. You could make other arguments, you know, like the fact that nurturing is so closely associated with women and less with men, that's problematic too. Rather than spreading it over between the two, that's a problem too. But I would pick the authority, I guess, for inequality. Yeah, there's a question back there.
What has made you so passionate about this topic?
I could say a lot of things. My own life, of course, but the lives of other people I see around me, just a desire to see everybody have a life in which they can really live up to their full potential, and wondering kind of why we do this. You know, why do we have to have this? These kinds of relatively arbitrary forms of inequality that are based on things like the sex we're born into, or that adopt, even if it's the sex we adopt, but the sex we're categorized and kept in. That should be a basis of our life outcomes, independent of who we think we are, what we want to be. That's always disturbed me. It's always bothered me. So, yeah.
Don't you think that the stereotype about not being nurturing is gone when it comes to the millennial men?
See, that's a great question. And I hope so. I know many people have told me that, right? I don't see, by say I don't see, I don't mean that I think there's no evidence of that. I think there's not evidence. We need to study this, right? We need more evidence about it. I think millennials are better, for sure, about this. I don't know, right? I don't know the evidence. I mean, people have told me, millennial men, no, they do this, they want to do nurturing. I hope it's true. We just need to see the evidence, but I hope it is true. And if it is true, that's a huge change, right? That's a huge change. The implications of that will be complicated. We all have to work that out, right? Because it does imply a big change in the work world, right? Because it's hard for both men and women to have time for taking care of others and nurturing and also work 100 hours a week, right? And right now we valorize, in our best paid jobs and best kind of stuff, what they call overwork, right? What is called in sociology overwork, and valorize that. And so in a sense it requires some stepping back from that on the part of both men and women. And then people don't want to do that because they think, wait, I'm giving up my competitive position in the global world and all that. So there's a lot, there's a lot there. But it would be a fabulous beginning of the change if millennial men are changed. I hope it's true. I just don't, and I'm not saying I don't think it is. I just literally don't know the evidence. I don't think anybody has the evidence yet. There.
So you said it was a stall in 1990. Also, wouldn't there be a stall after World War II as well? Because during the war, there was a lot of more women working and whatnot. So wouldn't there be a stall after the war as well? Because
That's a good question. It's not really so much a stall after World War. There was, if you look at women's involvement in the labor force, which is the most obvious predictor there, you see it's kind of going up through the 20s. In the 30s, it's going up at a very slow rate. And then we hit World War II. Men get drafted. We get Rosie the Riveter, right? Women's labor force involvement pops way up, right? And then right after the war, it flattens back to just about where it was before the war and goes on from there. So the war had about that much impact in the long-term involvement of women's labor force. Now, it did mobilize women. It did mobilize women to change. But then what happens, interestingly, right, in the 50s, which is it was a culturally post-war, it was the baby boom, it was the picket fence, it was back to a kind of ideological valorization of some traditional gender stuff. And yet, on the other hand, coincided with the flooding of the first beginnings of married women starting to work in great numbers. And part of that had to do with the growth of corporations, the expansion of corporations, and the fact that the job of clerical work had become sex-labeled as a woman's job, and there weren't enough single women to do it. So employers got over their prejudice about hiring married women, started hiring married women, and the economy became a vacuum cleaner that sucked women into the labor force despite that ideology going on there, right? So you get this kind of interesting transformation. So yes, there was a thing, but the World War II was kind of just a blip, is what it comes down to. It's like a blip like that. But if you look at the steady line, then it goes up. It goes up and up and up and up through the 60s, and then in the 70s, boom, it goes way up. From the 70s to the 90s, you get this big change, right? Boom, fast change. And then level off. On this
you said it was a change in the 60s. Would that do anything to do with like the Vietnam War?
Well, it was less about the war. It was less about the war than women's growing education. And of course, there were movements, right? There was the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and that was a political thing that had an impact on it. But it's also the case that women had gradually been increasing their education. They used to have lower education than men. And it was only in the 50s and early 60s that they started to get closer. They started to have the same high school education as men. And then they started to go to college. And it was the 60s and the 70s in which women started to really go to college. And then that started to bring them in, and then with the way feminists started to move into men's professions, and that sort of happened. So it was less about the Vietnam War. And things had changed a little bit, and in the Vietnam War, and more women, for instance, went to the Vietnam War than went to World War II themselves as soldiers and stuff. So it was probably, the Vietnam War only involved about 50,000 people or something like that. So it wasn't on the same scale as a proportion of the population as World War II. So it didn't have the same massive effect. Yeah.
In discussions like this, there seems to be this line of thinking that persists, which is there are gender stereotypes that men and women are different, but that doesn't mean they're inherently unequal.
Yeah.
Can you respond to that sentiment?
Yeah, that people say, well, sure, there's difference, but difference, yeah, they're, embrace the differences. They're different and equal, right? The problem is the way we define difference right now isn't equal, right? Because the stuff that we think men are, we pay better and give more power to and think is more valuable. It's higher status. And we do that despite the fact that we value the stuff women do, but we both think it's great. Women are wonderful. Women are wonderful. They're mothers. Yeah, we think it's great. Yes, and yet on the other hand, we also think it's, childcare work is terribly paid. It's one of the lowest paid jobs there is. Why is that? Why? We don't, and when someone says, what's the most, how can you make your name in society? What would you know? Don't say, so there's this two-sidedness, that women are good, but good, that's not what people of power and money, where we put our money, where we put our value, what we do, isn't with that, despite what we say. So we have this complex ambivalence towards women, right? It's not that women in the modern world, classic, old-fashioned, I don't like women kind of stuff is not very common, right? We have a lot of what people who study prejudice call benevolent sexism, meaning sexism in which you think women are wonderful, just poor dears, not quite up to it, And so it's that. Well, men and women live together, right? It's not a place where outright hatred of one another is going to be very practical, right? Talking about organizing social relations, that's not going to. And there is some mutual appreciation between men and women. So it isn't it rarely has the vicious edge that racial prejudice sometimes has and things like that, but it still has the demeaning, patronizing edge. So that's the issue.
Okay, one question.
Okay.
What are some suggestions you would have for overcoming this frame?
I think of gender as this kind of complicated system that of things. It's been going on a long time. It infuses our institutions as well as ourselves and personalities and our interpersonal relations and how that work out. So we obviously need to change those big cultural beliefs up there, right? If I think those are causing all these other problems. But how do you change them? Probably not by saying, I think we need to change those cultural beliefs, right? You're not just talking about it. You change it really with those, a lot of material changes, right? We made some changes, right? Through the 70s, we need to do more. So women changing their behavior and also men changing their behavior. Women have moved over and are increasingly doing the things that men do. And that's good and fine. We also need some more moving, and maybe this is the millennials, of men doing more of the things that women do. And so that these things become more equalized in value and in activity. And even if we value some of them more than others, that isn't a difference between men and women. In other words, everybody does some of the more valued things and some of the less valued things. So I think it's continual political effort, legal effort, and people changing their lives, people just trying to find their way and make their life. But I think you have to hit at it. It's kind of, I think of it as like you can't move a sandbar, right, by just getting out your shovel, you're not going to get very far. But the ocean can move the sandbar because it hits it and hits it and hits it and hits it, and it doesn't stop. And that's how you change, and that's how gender changes, like that.
All right,
Okay, thank you very much.